So, it's a man's world. Also, the lyrics of the James Brown song would have us believe. But for me, it is not a man's world. This is a picture of me in 1999 as a staff nurse in an emergency unit in a London teaching hospital. But I've actually come here today to tell you that I do not think men should be nurses. And actually, I do not think I should be a nurse either. Now, this poses a bit of a problem for me, given that on a day-to-day basis, I'm a senior lecturer in nursing, teaching nursing to student nurses. So I think by Monday, my job could be at risk. But actually, we also see that more nurses are leaving the NHS than joining it. And in our UK nursing schools, we're seeing numbers declining year on year. So actually, I should be encouraging men to be nurses rather than actually discouraging them to be nurses. But it hasn't always been that way. In 250 BC in ancient India, men were the sole carers. And in the 12th century, the Alexian Brotherhood devoted their lives to the care of the sick and the dying. And in the 15th century, a Portuguese soldier turned from his military career to be a full-time healthcare worker. Today, to give you 4 reasons why I do not think men should be nurses. And my first reason is society's perception of what nursing is. Now, as an academic, we teach, but we also do research. And for the purpose of this talk today, I've undertaken 2 rather rudimentary research studies. And the first one involved me going online and Googling images of nurses. And of the first 100 images that I saw, only 12 of them contained an image of a man. And even then, it wasn't really that discernible as to whether they were a doctor or a nurse. My second click took me to this image. And here we see the majority of the images are female, and the majority of them are wearing caps. Now, in 30 years, I haven't known of any nurses to be wearing caps. My third click, and I would warn you all that if you're doing this on a works computer or your home computer, you may wish to delete your browsing history afterwards. Because actually, here were some of the tamer images that I came across. I want you to remember that picture of me earlier on. It was on a night shift. I just stepped out of a trauma room, trying to save somebody's life. I'd been wearing a lead apron for over an hour. I was emotionally drained. I was physically drained. I was sweaty. And I can tell you now, I probably didn't smell very nice either. I can't think of anything sexy about that image. My second study involved asking some children at a local school to draw for me their perceptions of what a nurse is. And I received 20 pictures back from 6 to 7-year-olds. And of those 20 pictures, 16 of them were of women, 14 of them were wearing caps, and one of them, as you'll see here on the image, is the only one that's clearly discernible as a man. But actually, if you also notice, he too is wearing a cap. And what I really want to know is, where does this perception of nursing come from with children at such a young age? And I think I might have an answer. A fellow TEDxer at a local museum sent me this picture about 3 weeks ago. And it's of a backpack in a museum, and the image on the front of this has a nurse wearing a cap. And I've looked around and I've seen similar imagery like this in toy stores and on newspaper stands that are directed towards children. So this is what their perception is of nursing. Some of you may recall this lady. Her name's Jessica Anderson, and she's a nurse at the Royal London Hospital. And she ran this year's 2019 London Marathon in the fastest time whilst wearing a nurse's uniform. And you may recall that she was denied that record by the Guinness Book of World Records because she was not wearing a nurse's uniform. That is her nurse's uniform. Now, what the Guinness Book of World Records would actually have us believe is a nurse's uniform is this. In my 30 years of nursing, I have never seen a nurse's uniform like this, least of all being worn by a man. My second reason for why I do not think men should be nurses has to come from the portrayal of nursing and men in nursing from the feature films that we see. And in 2008, an academic and nurse in Australia, David Stanley, undertook a study and published his research, Celluloid Angels, a review of nursing in feature films from 1900 to 2007. He reviewed 280 movies, and of those, 26.4% of them contained sexual or alluring images. And I'm pretty sure one can remember the carry-on films of the 60s and the 70s. But he concluded through his research and his literature review that actually nurses were angels or devils, divas or doormats. And in 2012, he undertook another study, Celluloid Devils, a review of men in nursing in feature films. And he reviewed 13 films. Now, some of you may well be familiar with the film Meet the Parents, where Greg, the male nurse, is constantly berated for being a male nurse. He's asked, "Are you gay? Did you fail at medical school? And why would you do nursing?" And I can actually say that these are questions that I have had directed towards myself in my whole career. And I've asked fellow colleagues if they've had similar experiences, and they've said yes. He concludes that article by saying that male nurses are effeminate, incompetent, and morally corrupt. So it brings me to my third point as to why I do not think men should be nurses. And this actually has to come from within my very own profession. Outside of religious orders, I cannot recall any profession that still uses gender-specific nouns to describe its workforce. Yet in nursing, we still use the term sister and senior sister to describe a senior nurse. And in 2003, the term matron was reintroduced. And I know of male colleagues who have adopted that title. Now, the term matron comes from the Latin mater, or to mother. And we actually see the term nurse used in similar areas where we see it used to describe breastfeeding, to nurse a child. And even from my very own experience as a nurse, I can remember when I graduated from the nursing school that I was at, I'm allowed to dubiously call myself a Bart's tart. My next point as to why I do not think men should be nurses has to come from the numbers, the statistics. And in the United Kingdom, there are 600,000 registered nurses, and of those, only 11% of them are men. And we see similar figures in the United States, Canada, and Australia. The only country that seems to differ from that would be Saudi Arabia, where we see figures around about 30 to 50%. And I think we should compare that to another profession in healthcare that's had its fair share of gender disparity in the past. And we're talking about medicine. But actually, we see that UK medical schools throughout England can actually boast that over 50% of their students are actually female. So I want to know, what are they doing right that nursing is not? And it brings me to another point where the numbers are involved. When I started my nurse training in 1990, when I started then, I remember sitting down with a colleague who said to me that you're here to make up the numbers. I am, in fact, a token male. So I'd like to recap for you. I am a failure. I didn't get into medical school. I didn't get the exams. I am confused, not only about my choice of career, but clearly about my sexuality. I am morally corrupt. I am incompetent. And I am also a sin against nature. But I clearly have one thing going for me. I am sexy. I heard that. You are probably forgiven for not recognizing who this lady is. She is in fact Edith Cavell, who was a British nurse during World War I, who went to Belgium and she tended to the sick and the wounded of not only the British and the Allied troops, but also the German troops as well. And in 1912, she was arrested by the German police. And on the night before her execution by firing squad, she is reported to have written that I cannot stop while people still need my help. I think you can agree with me that Edith Cavell was no angel, diva, doormat or devil. Which then brings me to this lady, and she's in fact Florence Nightingale. And if I were to ask you, she was a pioneer in nursing. She did improve public health in the Crimea. But actually, if we were to flip what we know about Florence Nightingale, we may have a different perception of what nursing is. But while Florence Nightingale was out in the Crimea, she wasn't only caring for the sick and the dying and improving public health. She was actually collecting a lot of data. And she presented her data to the then British government in what we call the polar area diagram, to which Florence Nightingale is credited. It's a form of pie chart. And in this chart, she's recorded the deaths from preventable and non-preventable causes, as well as deaths in certain months. And so she presented this data to the British government. And as a result of that, Florence Nightingale was accepted as the first female member of the Royal Society of Statisticians in 1859. And in 1874, she became a fellow of the American Statistical Association. So what if, when I ask you to remember what Florence Nightingale was famous for, you went, she was a phenomenal mathematician, she was a wonderful statistician, she was a lobbyist, and oh, by the way, she happened to be a very, very good nurse as well. Would that change our young people's perception of what nursing is? You recall the pictures that were drawn by those children earlier on. And the teacher that got the children to draw those pictures spent more time with the children discussing how men could be nurses than actually it took for the children to draw the pictures. He spent time with them. So I can see out there are grandparents, parents, and there are no doubt teachers in the room. So my challenge to you is, if you are working with children or youngsters and you come across these sorts of images, please just challenge them and say, you know what, boys can be nurses as well. Up until Wednesday, this backpack was in a museum. I spent last week negotiating to get this backpack out of the museum, okay? Now, I'm not asking you to go into museums and shops and buy all their merchandise and take it all out of circulation. I'm not asking you to do that. But you could do as another fellow TEDxer did when she challenged the shopkeeper, and I don't know quite whether he's recovered from that, but she challenged the shopkeeper about the stereotypes of nursing that were portrayed on a particular backpack. But again, all I'd ask you to do is, if you see this imagery, just think, you know what, that's probably not a correct portrayal of nursing. And likewise, I'm not expecting you to write to your Hollywood producers and say, you know what, you're wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. And equally, I'm not asking you to boycott movies. Because actually, I have to confess, I really actually enjoyed Meet the Parents. But I watched it with 3 other colleagues, one of whom happened to be a man. And we sat there and we discussed how that was wrong, that was right, maybe that shouldn't happen. So again, if you come across these sorts of images, maybe just have a conversation, or even for yourselves consider, you know what, this probably isn't the correct portrayal of nursing. But I have a challenge for you. You may have the misfortune of going to hospital and being treated. And if somebody comes up to you and says they're a sister, or a senior sister, or a matron, maybe just challenge them and say, hey, do you not think that term's maybe a bit outdated, or dare I say sexist? If you're not that brave, then maybe just ask them, what's the male equivalent of your title called? And see if that changes any perceptions. So I started this presentation by saying that I do not think men should be nurses. And I also said I do not think I should be a nurse. But I've given you 4 reasons that people are seeing that give a negative imagery of what nursing is. I would also ask you, if a young man comes to you and says they want to be a nurse, please don't ask them if they're gay, they failed at medical school, or why have you chosen that career. Encourage them to choose that. And this very week, I had the privilege of standing aside these guys who graduated this year as nurses and have pursued their career as nurses. And I am proud to be a nurse. Thank you.